We are now entering the final leg of our journey in upgrading the War of the Ring board game. So far, all of the miniatures have been painted, new faction tokens have been made, 3D rings of power were sculpted, and all 24 stronghold cities and ruins were crafted out of clay. All we have left is the mountain ranges and a 3D Mount Doom track. The first step for creating the mountain ranges were to copy their outlines using tracing paper. I followed the black line on the board and thickened them up in areas where it got more complex. This was to make each range structurally stronger and allow for more room for details. The ranges were labeled and cut out with an X-Acto knife. Since the tracing paper is transparent and you can see through it, the word on is written next to the mountain, so I know to keep them on that side. If they're upside down, say no. The outlines are laid out on chipboard and cut out to give a foundation for the mountains to sit on. It's important to check to make sure the chipboard foundations fit correctly over the black lines on the board before more work is done to them. For the construction of the mountains themselves, I'm using XPS insulation board and an insulation knife. Normally I use a serrated steak knife, but decided to upgrade, and this is probably the cleanest cut you can get without using a hot wire tool. Just be careful because it can cut you.
Still sharp.
Using a 1-inch thick ruler, the XPS is cut into squared segments. Then the corners are cut off to give me these triangular strips that are all of a similar width and height. The triangular strips are cut to fit and glued onto the chipboard foundations. I try to cover the majority of the chipboard, not worrying about gaps or differences in heights. Simple white PVA glue is enough to hold these down. To create the details of the mountains, the edge of the insulation knife is dragged across the foam. This causes tearing and makes the foam look more like stone. I got this idea from watching Bob Ross. He created paintings of mountains with a palette knife by dragging a lighter paint across a darker outline. Be careful when doing this and take your time. The blade should be doing the work, so hold it gently. Any areas that hung over the chipboard were cut away with an X-Acto knife, and some notches were cut into the tips of the mountains to make them look less uniform. The next step was filling in gaps with spackle. Using my finger, I pressed the spackle into the openings or any area I hit too hard with the insulation knife. The spackle is left to dry for 24 hours before moving on to the next step. To give the mountains durability and to lock in the spackle, I'll be using the same resin that I used to create the faction symbols from episode 1. The 2-part resin is mixed together, then poured onto the mountain ranges. There is a piece of parchment paper underneath, as it is one of the few things resin will not stick to. I then use a piece of foam to sponge on the resin and make sure it covers the entire mountain range. The resin is left to cure for 24 hours. After the resin cures, the mountains are painted black to make sure none of the pink foam shows through. They were then painted 4 different color patterns to match their location in Middle Earth. Green vibrant mountain ranges for the north, and dead black volcanic mountains for Mordor. The ones that run through Gondor are often referred to as the White Mountains, so they were painted white, while the others were painted a more traditional gray. For each mountain range, I started with the darkest version of the color I wanted, then stained them with either Agrax Earthshade or Melon Oil. Then dry brushed them with 2 slightly lighter tones. These gray mountains eventually got a white snow dry brushing to really make them stand out. Once the paint dries, you will have nice 3D representations of uncrossable borders. So your opponent will have no excuse when they want to redo their turn because they thought they could attack Orthanc from Fangorn Forest. Deep in the heart of Mordor lies Mount Doom, the one place where the Ring of Power can be destroyed, and a fitting final challenge to this video series. In War of the Ring, Mount Doom works as a track that the Fellowship can complete to win the game. I want the track to ascend like a staircase as Frodo and Sam get closer and closer to destroying the ring, while also having an imposing presence on the table during play. I decided to use an LED tea light I found at a dollar store. The mountain will be built around the light, and it will hopefully throw off a volcanic glow. The first thing was to cut into the light to see the inner workings and to see if the size could be reduced to save room on the board. Using a Dremel, I cut into the plastic housing and around the light. Once inside, I realized this plastic part needs to stay, as it weighs down the switch and allows the light to be turned on. To make the staircase the ring bearers climb, a socket wrench socket was selected according to the size of the miniature's base. In this case, it was a 14mm socket. The socket and tea light were then outlined onto a piece of paper and cut out so it could be measured to see how much room it would take up in Mordor. The fit looked good, so it was time to start building the staircase. Now, if you watched my previous video, this part should be nothing new, and if you haven't, you should check it out because it took a long time to do. Super Sculpey is rolled out and wrapped around the socket wrench sockets. They're cut to size and baked in the oven. I made 5 of ascending height. An oversized base was cut out of chipboard with the hole for the tea light in the center. The tea light has these small feet underneath, so the chipboard base had to be built up to match the height. Some of the extra plastic was sanded away with a Dremel. This also helped to taper the tea light into a more volcano shape. The clay rings were set around a synthetic wine cork. The rings had to be broken in order to fit around the corks, and the corks had to be cut to different sizes to build up the staircase. I wanted to leave enough of the clay rings to make them flush with the ring bearer's miniature when it was placed inside. Some sanding with my Dremel was necessary. Hot glue was used to hold down the corks and to create a seal around the tea light. To keep the clay rings in place, a hot glue seal was applied around the corks. Mount Doom is starting to take shape. The cone of the volcano was created with epoxy sculpt. I go into epoxy sculpt in more detail in my previous video. You know, the one I told you to check out already. If you haven't checked it out, just pause the video here and go watch that video, and then you can come back. I work in layers and make sure to give the epoxy sculpt time to dry. The first layer was filling in gaps between the corks and tea light. Once that dried, this layer had to be built like a wall, so epoxy sculpt didn't cover the tea light switch. The next layer was when I started to construct the cone of the volcano and begin to press in some fine details. I stopped at the top step because I wanted to build a doorway that actually leads into the volcano. The door was made with chipboard and cardstock. It was glued in place, and the next layer of epoxy sculpt was constructed around it. Once everything finally cured, the extra chipboard of the base was cut off, and spackle was used to seal the corks. When the spackle dried, Mount Doom was primed gray and base coated with black acrylic paint. I made sure to paint as much of the inside of the volcano as possible, something I probably should have done before I started building, since the tea light is now pretty hard to reach. After that, the whole thing was painted with red stain, so it would look similar to the Mordor mountain ranges. And 2 coats of slightly lighter grays were dry brushed on top to bring out the mountain's details. The clay rings surrounding the Mordor track were painted light gray to stand out from the black volcano. A series of yellows and oranges were blended into the gray gate that leads to the Crack of Doom to depict a warm glow coming from within, and the same was done for the cone of Mount Doom. I ended up going back and painting the platform for each step on the Mount Doom track black, since I wasn't liking the way the gray turned out. The last step was to paint the elvish numbers seen on the board. These were free-handed on with shades of red that got slightly brighter, eventually ending with a bright pink. This was to make the script look illuminated and glowing. With the elven numbers finished, the tea light can be turned on, and Mount Doom can be returned to Mordor. This 3-dimensional Mount Doom looks great lurking in the far corners of the board, and is a perfect centerpiece for the late game action. Tea light even gives off a nice glowing feeling. Now with Mount Doom complete, Middle-earth can rest. The War of the Ring is over, and it should be time for celebrating. But there was an unseen evil brewing just below the checklist that even my foresight missed. Where am I gonna put all this stuff? Tolkien once said, once your board game is out of the box, you can never put it back in again. Okay, he didn't say that, but I'm trying to make a reference to the Scouring of the Shire. You know, like when you think the book is over, it probably should be, but there's 3 more chapters. It's when the hobbits fight Sauron for the Shire. Yeah, no wonder the movies cut this part out. Just just go to the graphic. Alright, so the plan here was to make a bottom tray that can house all of the things I made for these videos, and work in unison with the existing one that holds all the figures, cards, and dice. A sheet of EVA foam was cut to the size of the base of the box. Everything that needed to fit in it was then laid out in rows to give me an idea of how much space it would take up. Some of the strongholds had to be laid down because they were too tall. The tallest stronghold was then measured to give me the height needed for the dividers, and several strips of that width were cut from the EVA foam. I started with pieces that surrounded the outside and work as a wall. These were glued in place with hot glue. The divider strips were dry fitted in to make sure they were the right size. Then the strongholds and cities were added back in. There's a piece of EVA foam in between each to make sure that there would be enough room when the horizontal dividers were added in. The vertical dividers are then hot glued down, and it was important to not get any of the glue on the finished strongholds while completing the step. This process was continued until all the pieces were divided up. I had some leftover space in the center that I planned on using for the rings and faction tokens. Next, smaller strips were cut to work as horizontal dividers and give each stronghold their own compartment. These strips had to be cut slightly shorter to allow the structures to be picked up. I also gave Barrador this pillow to make sure the tower didn't break. A divider was made for the faction tokens and victory points trackers. This piece of foam had 4 slots cut into it to house the rings, and was carefully glued into the center of the tray. I still had some extra room, so I tossed in the hunt tiles to the final opening. I realized that I'd probably never get everything back in its same spot again after taking them out for a game, so using an extra sheet of stronghold titles from my previous video, I cut them out and glued them into the corresponding pocket. Then the last thing left to do was place the existing storage tray on top and close the box. The edges of the plastic tray sit perfectly on top of the foam foundation, and the box lid only hangs over an extra inch or so from its original closing. And with that,
It's done.
everything I set out to upgrade for this game is now complete, and my work is now finished. If you haven't seen the previous videos in the series, go back and watch them. If you have been here since the start, here at last on the shores of the sea comes the end of our fellowship. I now go to the Undying Lands to heal from my X-Acto blade cuts and hot glue burns. This is not the end, but just the beginning, as I have many things planned for this year, and I hope to see you all there.